Okay, everybody. I'm now wrangling. Thank you all for the conversation. If everyone can please take their seats, we're going to start the next panel. Excellent. Thank you so much. So I thought the last panel, I'm trying to do a little bit of summary at the end of each of these panels. And the last one was really interesting because the first panel we were really talking about baseline and what happened at the beginning of the digital industry and why we ended up with so many problems. And it was really about cleaning up metadata, getting the basics down. And the last panel, to me, that kind of showed that there's a couple of different insights that I gleaned from that. One was that there are now business opportunities for startups and for businesses that are working to solve different problems in the metadata space, and that there's opportunities outside of just the baseline of knowing who's contributed to what. And those niches are really important for the entire ecosystem, but none of that would be possible until we would have all the major stakeholders and DDEX and all the basic things in the supply chain around. And the notes that I took down on these niche problems are really performing rights organizations, not only one performing rights organization, but infrastructure for back offices. The in-studio on the sound recording side, making sure that each of the contributors to a song is being captured in the studio. Micropayments and the transaction size, that in a digital world, our transaction size is usually less than a cent, and in the physical world, in bricks and mortar, it was about $20. So you think about the infrastructure that's needed for that. And then the last was really attribution, and not necessarily on the revenue side, but attribution of all of the different contributors. So most of the discussions that we've had to date this morning have really been about sound recording. And for those of us who have been in this industry for a while, you may remember that it took about 12 years for us to get all of that organized. It took the establishment of DDEX, it took the adoption of DDEX, it took all of the people on the label side to see that it actually really does matter. And some of the things in the world of digital music, the way payments are transacted, we do have these micropayments, but the way licensing generally works is there's a licensee and a licensor, and you agree to terms, and you're paying on a quarterly or an annual basis. So it's kind of decoupled from the actual metadata and the micropayments, which is why we all have to draw the dots between these different pieces of the ecosystem and explain why it's important for everyone. I do feel like we've gotten to the point where, thanks to DDEX and thanks to all of the major labels and all of the entities that have really worked on the DSP side to move the process forward, we've really gotten to a much better place on the sound recording side. However, publishing is the next big frontier. And this year we've had the passage of the Music Modernization Act, and that's a watershed movement forward for the publishing industry. And there's a lot of different aspects of that piece of legislation, and we're not going to get into all aspects of it, but we really want to focus on the publishing metadata. Not only the ISWC, which is the core identifier that's associated with publishing and the composition, but also the data practices. We've had things that have bubbled up in the licensee and licensor world for the DSPs. Everything has been about following that sound recording from the label into the DSP. And then publishing is figured out after the fact when the two are reconciled. So we know immediately once these things are decoupled, that's where the problems begin. But we have some experts on the panel today, and this is a discussion on data practices in a post-Music Modernization Act world. And I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us just a little bit about what you do at your companies, and then we're going to go and talk really about three main topics. One is about data practices, getting the sound recording and the underlying composition closer together, and then advice for anyone in the room. So, Lisa?
Hi. Thanks all for being here. It's a great turnout. I applaud you for being interested in this. My name is Elisa Coleman. I am primarily the COO of ABCO Music and Records, and in my spare time, I am on the RIAA board. I am the president of the AIMP in New York City, and I am on the MLC board, which is one of the companies running to be designated by the Copyright Office to run the music licensing collective established under the MMA.
Lots of acronyms.
Lots of acronyms, yes.
Lots of acronyms. So when you're speaking of acronyms, try to remember not everybody in the room is quite as deep in this as you may be.
So yes, and even more challenging to get many people here that it's lunchtime almost. So yes, good morning everyone. I'm Sylvain Piat, Director of Business at CSAC, which is the International Confederation of Societies of Authors. And we are gathering collective management organizations worldwide. We represent around 230 societies from 122 countries, I believe. And well, basically we represent what you call the PROs in the US, the performing rights organizations, but also mechanical rights entities. In many countries, it's the same entities that manage both rights, and we are the confederation that is gathering all those entities.
Hi, I'm Joe Conyers. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of SongTrust. We help over 170,000 songwriters and publishers collect their royalties from all around the world. We're part of Downtown Music Holdings, and I'm also a member of the operational committee for the MLC.
Hello, I'm Paul Jessup. I'm a not very well recovering metadata nerd, and I'm an independent consultant, but RIAA is one of my biggest and most valued clients, but anything I say is my responsibility if I get sued. I have a strong professional interest in a lot of the unique IDs that populate this space. I run the ISRC system for the United States. Pro bono, as my kids say to me, Dad, you don't get this consultancy thing, do you? I look after the sort of evangelism for ISNI in the music industry. Separately, I look after DOI, the Digital Object Identifier, and that powers the IDA system that Will Kreth will be talking about later. And I almost guarantee that no one has heard of the ISLI, the International Standard Link Identifier, which some of us think may have a role in identifying the links between recordings and works. So that would be a first-class data object that links those two together and has provenance and quality and trustability.
So on the publishing side, I think there's an average of about 6 contributors per song now. And a data point that I shared earlier is there's about 25,000 songs every day that are uploaded to music services. If you take 25,000 songs a day, back of the napkin math, 6 contributors on the publishing side on an annual basis, it's really easy to get upwards of 40 to 50 million different contributors that need to have their songs that they've contributed to in any percentage associated with the sound recording and get paid out. In the past, the practices have really been for the publishers to provide their data to a couple of different private entities, and then there's a matching magic that's done under the hood. One of the constructs of the legislation has been making a publicly accessible database available. This database, we haven't really quite defined that, but right now we can look up ISRCs and we can look up ISWCs. But what does that really mean to have an open mandate of a publicly accessible database? What do you think the impact will be on the publishing sector of having this open database?
Oh, it will greatly amplify what the missing pieces are. I mean, right now, when you go to ASCAP or you go to BMI or you go to CZAC and you look up a song, you'll see how much each of them claim. But you'll never be able to see a complete picture of a work at any one place. This database will allow you to see a complete picture on the publishing shares of every single song that's entered into the database. Now, the challenge is that we have to educate not just the publishing community, but the songwriter community in the same way that they go and register their songs at ASCAP or BMI or CSAC or PRS or any performing rights organization to then come to this database portal and enter their song and register it there. So there's an education process that has to happen, but at the same time, it's going to be a greater transparency in showing who's, hanging out there. Like, I have songs that have like 3% hanging out there that, like, when somebody tries to clear them for sync and they can't find this 3% writer, the production company will make a decision to go on the hook for that writer. And it's not my writer. It's an independent writer. Nobody knows where they are. Nobody knows how to get in touch with them. This will amplify that and show people who needs to get in touch with whom. I just think that people don't know where to go. There are too many places to go to get your information correct right now.
So consolidating.
Yes.
I think this is one of the biggest unsung parts of what will happen post-MMA is American sync licensing is going to get just a bit more easy. And that's going to reduce a lot of friction in that world. Because today, we see it all the time. I just can't clear that last 3% or 10% or can't get a hold of those two writers fast enough. And this is going to be a nice thing to have it all in one place.
I want to make sure everyone in the room understands this as well, because when you have splits with publishing, so on the sound recording side, there's a label that owns the sound recording, and so there's really one owner. On the publishing side, if there are 6 different writers that are contributing to a song, they also have 6 different PROs, and they probably have 6 different publishers.
At least.
And so they're at least. And so their data is everywhere. And from the writer's point of view, they say, okay, great, I've entrusted my baby to ABCO and to BMI. And so they think it's done. But when you are on the other side of this and you're looking at it from a monetization standpoint, either in a streaming environment, all the different splits have to be matched on the back end, but in a sync environment, you need 100% of the publishing, which means if you have that 3% that's hanging out there, you can't license that song for sync. And that's kind of the holy grail of publishing, of being able to get your music into a game or a movie or an ad.
Yeah.
Sylvan, talk a little bit about, this is a U.S. piece of legislation, but I believe that there will be repercussions around the world. Can you speak a little bit about CZAC's view on that?
Well, I agree. I mean, we see it as a great opportunity as well. I mean, however, I mean, there are big challenges because experience has proven in the past that gathering information about ownership is really difficult. But when you have to aggregate the information coming from 3, 4, 10 different parties about the ownership of mechanical rights and performing rights for PROs, it's always difficult. So I think it will be. I'm very curious to see how it will happen. Okay. And how it will be organized to set up this database. And also you have to keep in mind that it's of course for the American repertoires, but it should also apply to all repertoires from worldwide. So what will happen for the European repertoires in the US for mechanical rights? What will happen for where we have not only publishers having shares, but also creators themselves, which is not the case for what we call US copyright. for the what we are used to call the continental European mechanical rights, creators still have a share in mechanical rights. So we'll see, how it will get organized. Of course, we have to follow up closely about what will happen there and to see whether we can help, and we'll speak later about ISWC, I believe. But yes, it will be really interesting to see how it will happen.
We have to be very careful that we're building on firm ground and not on shifting sand. And that firm ground is, I think, the identity of the things we're licensing and matching together. And without that firm ground, the rest of our efforts may be in vain. So let me just first mention about ISRC.
And what do you mean by firm ground versus shaky?
I mean that it's completely clear to anybody what the correct identifier for a particular recording or work is. There's no argument that he says, she says, two different views. There has to be one unique identifier. Otherwise, people will use different identifiers and they won't match to each other unless they have been authoritatively matched. And we're going to have to deal with legacy and do that because behavior hasn't always been good. And I think Sylvain can talk to not misbehavior, but accidents that have happened in the past that they're making sterling efforts to clean up. But in the US, we don't have a solid registry of codes for recordings. And many of us have been trying to make that happen. And I think the last time that this event was in a room that was sold out and full and people were being turned away at the door, we were talking about having a registry of ISRC codes, and we still haven't got it. And we are looking, we'd certainly like within the US to say, we will recognize a particular database as being the source of, we could call ground truth. And that's a work in progress. We don't want that to interfere with what the MLC is doing, but we think it's important because you can't trade in musical work. You can only trade in something that embodies it. You can license it, but you can't actually use it except if you record it or if you print it. The abstract work is as it says, abstract. And so the recording identification is critical because that's what drives the exploitation of both the recording and the work. And we need to make sure that's solid.
So in the U.S., we have this religion around competition. And, but what you seem to be proposing is that the centralization and having one or several that are officially designated as a source of validated data.
I think there are some natural monopolies. And if you're trying to give unique identifiers, you need to either have one entity or entities that cooperate with each other, otherwise they'll collide. So I don't think that entity should be involved in anything tremendously commercial or business-like, but it needs to be a trusted entity that's respected by everyone and to which everyone will turn when they want to know what the answer is. That doesn't seem to be particularly offensive to any pro-competition agenda.
So in a world of having a more centralized database, but we have, I think, 120,000 publishers in the U.S. of all different shapes and sizes, what are the best practices of having a central data source? Is it constant data and API feeds and incremental feeds of changes in ownership? Joe, maybe you might have an opinion about what those data practices should look like.
The answer is yes, and these are ever-changing databases. And we're entering into a world post-MMA where just in time to get the MLC up and running, we have a huge amount of new decentralized database about to start. You have our friends at Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, and every single other video UGC service scrambling to get ahead of our Article 17 and creating a whole nother set of new databases that publishers, songwriters, and their agents will have to manage.
Can you talk about what is Article 17 for the group?
Article 17 is a ruling inside of the European Commission. I think you might even be able to handle this a little bit better, but I'll try in my mediocre American and British mindset here. it will essentially require additional burden on any sort of user-generated content service in order to police the things that happen on their platform if they're of a certain scale. And it has recently been ratified by the European Commission and all its member states. I think almost all of them voted for for this. And the practical of it is that a YouTube, a Instagram, et cetera, will have to take down and keep down in some sense and just be more vigilant about what their users are doing on platform. And if copyright owners or intellectual property owners are saying, hey, this is an infringement, they have more of a burden and a liability to keep it down or do whatever the IP owner would like. And also they have more of a burden to attempt to do licensing. They're promoted essentially to they have a certain burden, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't exactly explain this, but they have an additional legal burden to seek out to license the works that are on their platform that are uploaded by user-generated, they're done through user-generated channels.
Thank you. I kind of sidetracked you on Article 17, what you were saying about data practices in this world, though.
Yes, so all of this data is constantly changing, and I think that's one of the other giant challenges in this space is splits are being updated, catalogs are being moved, sold, traded. You have income participant that is generated when you have a child or an ex-spouse or a interesting business deal. And so you have a lot of other interested parties around copyrights, and you have more databases than ever. And I don't think we're moving into a world where there are less databases, but having good and succinct identifiers, as I'm a very big fan of yours, and all the identifiers we can will make things work just a little bit easier. But it doesn't mean that we're not moving into a more complex world. It's just we're able to track the complexity, hopefully, with better identifiers, better links, and as you get more and more different databases, there can be collision detection across these databases, and you can start to say, okay, well, what went wrong? Where did it go wrong? Whose original source data is wrong? Is it that publisher? Is it this songwriter? Is it this agent? Is it this third party they hired? Or is it someone scamming them? And you can kind of triangulate a little bit better as we get more public and open databases with APIs and with downloadable bulk files.
In the past, we've had a lot of issues with publishers not wanting to share their data. Is that changing?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. I mean, the MLC is only for America, only for a very limited set of rights. The mechanical right is only one. And in fact, it's again, funny how legislation tends to be behind user behavior. The sync right has actually become way more valuable in the next 10 years than almost any other right. And the kinds of services that DSPs want to run, where there's incredible amounts of vertical video, where there are lyrics, rights outside of the mechanical, it's just in time for us to have more challenges at that time. And my company is obviously deeply trying to solve all these issues for our very large amounts of songwriters, and as are the largest music publishers and small to mid-sized and successful indies alike. I don't know.
Lisa, do you have an opinion about whether publishers are more open to sharing data?
Well, I think everyone recognizes the challenges that we have right now. I think that, having to go to 5 or 6 or 10 different places to register your songs and give everybody CWR, that's the digital program that stores all of the data on the splits and the writers, in case you don't know. To give that to all these different people and in exchange give it to one place, I think that we understand the trade-off that has to happen in order to make sure that the money flows correctly, that people participate, that everybody sees their fair share. I think that is the overarching theme. But, you have to take into consideration that just because this law has been enacted, I've said this from the very beginning, it's not waving a magic wand and making everything wonderful. It's going to be a Herculean task to get this done and to get it right. we as Americans, of course, think that we have the better way of doing it, but we have the same challenges that they have overseas. Also, as music publishers, we feel like we have a leg up over record companies who have not had a centralized database for ISRCs, where we have a centralized database for ISWCs. But there's a lot of work that has to go in and a lot of consideration of all different kinds of rights, as Joe said, interested parties, because you have to look at administrators and copyright owners and songwriters that are self-published and heirs. There's a lot of things to take into consideration to get this right.
And I think the other big thing people forget is that copyright is global. Copyright law is very local. Incredibly, painfully, sophisticatedly local, in the sense that one country may require so much more metadata that another country just will throw away and delete out of the file that they'll receive. And because of this, you have a primary standard in CWR that does everything and simultaneously does nothing. Because it has to cover every single edge case of every single society's wishes, and that's great, but it ends up being hard to comply to, and a lot of publishers do not properly comply to it, as much as many CMOs and PROs also have a custom version of it, and or do not integrate certain parts of the specification, which create all sorts of fun data challenges down the line.
Yeah, if you're going to ask the question, does sector X have a problem sharing its data, you need to define how much of the data you're talking about. There is some of this data which is intensely competition sensitive and which people want to keep very close to their chests. There's other data which, frankly, is just out there. The name of the song and the identity of the songwriter, that isn't particularly sensitive. The fact that that song exists, everyone should know that. The fact that a recording exists, anyone can see it. They can see it, buy it in the shops or download it from a store or stream it from a service. But when does the contract expire? That's critical information because you do not want the vultures hanging around the door the day before, etc.
But even with that, how do you consider, what about unreleased works? What about works that haven't been titled yet, but what are being used in live performances that they'd like to monetize just for performance and not create original works? There's a whole lot of other interesting, very far edge case in artistic communities that create all sorts of fun work for us to do.
Yeah.
And that's why this law is so different. It's very specific. It's very narrow. It is digital downloads and digital streams only. That's it. It's not YouTube. It's not Spotify's videos. It's not Apple Music's videos. It's their streams and the downloads only. So it's very, very, contained that way.
And even
you're going to have a database that's going to have very specific information on shares and splits.
And even more so, it is only 115, which means they have very set out procedures as to the way they can create different plans, whether a student or family plan. This is a very intense regulation, and whether or not the services decide that this is the way they want to run their businesses over the next couple of years is really a big question as well. They may or may not decide to do primary licensing of their works through this scheme. They may decide, hey, you know what, I want to do a semi-non-interactive service. I want to do a interactive service for clubs. I want 100 people in to be able to join a plan. They can dream up whatever they want and not have to use or license directly outside of this scheme. They may decide they want to pay more for the goodness of their hearts.
But they will still have access to the data.
But make no mistake,
it's compensated. We have, on DDEX, I remember the early days before DDEX was around, and there were lots and lots of problems with lack of standards. But on the DSP side, once the reporting is sent out to the MLC or any other kind of collective around the world, then it's incumbent upon them to make the matching work. Now, I would definitely be an advocate for open source matching, that global, that everyone's contributing to it, and we get that to be as precise as we possibly can. However, there's a lot of entities that consider their matching algorithm to be proprietary and a differentiating feature for their service. But this seems to be the underlying issue with all of this, is getting the sound recording and the publishing to be married up for all of the owners around a song. Sylvain, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you're doing with the ISWC? Because the process of getting ISWCs assigned for publishing has been part of the problem, and you announced a few months ago that you're tackling that.
Yeah. Well, indeed, I think you have to make a clear difference between, on one hand, the registration of works where you get all the information about the mechanical rights and you can aggregate this information, which is one step, and the second step, which is to make the link between the musical work and the sound recording. And this is where, when you make this link, very often at the moment, it's too late in the process because the sound recording has already been released. It has already millions of videos on YouTube or millions of streams on Spotify, and it's too late because the ISWC is not there. Because in most cases, before all the rights holders involved in the musical works can agree, for example, on how to split the rights among themselves, what is the publishing agreement between the creators and the publisher, then it's too late. And we could see many examples where it can take 6 months, 1 year even, in some cases, before all the interested parties in musical work agree on how to split, how to share the revenues. And in the meantime, they are losing money, of course. The creators are losing money, the publishers are losing money because the sound recording is out there and there is no way you can really make the correct claims. And in the context of the MMA, I believe it's becoming more crucial even because you want to give this authoritative information on musical works and sound recordings. And how you can do it at the moment is quite difficult. If you look at ISWC, it was created 20 years ago. And so at the time when digital was really something really for the future. But now we are there. We are in the digital age. And 15 years ago, we have created the first centralized database of ISWC, 15 years ago. But at this time, we applied some rules that could fit the physical world. But today, in the digital environment, it doesn't work anymore. And now we have launched a new project to completely revisit the ISWC to define new allocation rules so that you could assign an ISWC as quickly as possible at the time of the creation of the work, at the inception of the work. And we are working on different areas. For example, we have created what we call an allocation service, where instead of waiting for all the metadata related to musical work, you just need the name of the creators, the IP numbers of the creators, and you can get an ISWC. You don't need to wait for having all the shares and everything, because this is what PROs do today. They are waiting for this information to come in before they can assign an ISWC. So we have created these new rules to better accommodate this new environment. Now it's not perfect, okay, and we can see already that implementing this new rule is quite challenging because it requires a lot of changes on the PRO side, but also on the publisher side and the creator side. So you cannot implement a change like this in 1 week or 1 month or even 6 months. It really requires time. So we are working on that, and we have launched this new project for the ISWC database, and we are going to integrate in this new project new approaches as well to better accommodate these challenges. We have seen many projects, for example, to get ISWC at the time of the recording in the studios. Okay, so we are talking to some of these companies to see how we can better achieve this. But getting the ISWC as close to the source as possible is a key point in the value chain. If we really want the ISWC to be embedded in the sound recording before it is uploaded to the music platforms. And just one last point, it really requires commitment, participation of all the stakeholders in the value chain. Because even if you assign ISWC at the time of the creation, okay, how can you make sure that the label would upload this information to the DSP? You never know. We have seen many examples like this. ISWC exists, it has been sent, but not uploaded to the platform for whatever reasons that you are not aware of.
So these changes are welcome. But as we say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and this really does have to be very quick indeed, because we're at the moment at the position where you finish a recording at 2 o'clock in the morning in the studio and send it off for mastering. You need to have an ISWC in that package as it leaves the studio, or else we're in what is frankly a disgraceful situation that we're doing matching. Matching is always going to be imperfect. Attribution at the source is going to be so much more accurate. It's scandalous that music is leaving the studio without that information in its data packet. We've got all the technology in place to collect most of the data in the studio, but unless there's a work identifier in there as well, we are condemned forever to be matching.
It's an
Can you
incentives
talk-
issue. It's really an incentives issue around all this. You know, there are people who have no incentives to make sure that certain person in the room doesn't get a credit for that song. I just heard a really sad tale of an engineer who made some material changes to a song and was basically bought out by a very top 50 artist, top 10 artist, and they were just asked to not, participate in the writers' side of things, even though they made material changes, to a big detriment. And I think part of that culture hurts the ultimate identifier, and it's them shooting themselves in the foot. But you have to change just the creator culture, but also the technology incentive. Is what incentive does anyone in the value chain in the original part of the creation of the music, other than the goodwill of their hearts, to implement these standards and invest lots of money in technology if they're not really getting any money out of it? It's the right thing to do, but we have a lot of things we're supposed to do as I feel for the technologists who have a big roadmap and bosses that want to make their businesses profitable.
Yeah.
But let's not confuse the identification of a work with the enumeration of the rights and the participants in it. They are separate, they are different, and they can be managed separately. All that matters when that recording is finished and it goes out the door at 2 in the morning is that there's a number in there that you can trace back. That's what we need.
So can you talk about what is the process of being assigned an ISWC for composition?
Well, at the moment, to get an ISWC, to make it clear, what you need is a title for the work, okay? And for each of the composers and songwriters, you need what we call an IP name number, which is a CSAC IP number, okay, which is allocated by our members to their own affiliates. And usually, those people, they know about the IP name number, and they can send, for example, if they're using software in the studio, they can also put this number. But again, this is where I was talking about participation of all the stakeholders, including the creators themselves, because sometimes they don't really see the value of the metadata. This journey and it's also a matter of education. We spoke about education before. You need to educate we need to educate the creators, tell them, okay, before you upload a song or before you complete the metadata related to a song, make sure that you have everything done, because otherwise we won't be able to track the song, okay, and you will not get the royalties.
So who issues the ISWC?
It's, basically what you call PROs.
So as a songwriter, then I register at a PRO.
Yeah. Well, in the US, for example, it's songwriters or publishers. When they register the work at PROs, they include all this information in what we call the CWR files, and they will get ISWCs back. And what we are trying to do now is to assign those ISWC even before the publisher sends CWR files.
Lisa, you had something?
I had a question. So how long does it take to get an ISWC?
Well, as I said, sometimes it can take 1 year. If the publishers don't agree on how to split the rights, okay, and they cannot complete the information, it's still pending, there are conflicts, you cannot assign an ISWC. What we are changing now, okay? Now to get an ISWC, you don't need the shares, you don't need to register the full work, you only need the titles, the IP name numbers, and it can be done. The allocation service is next day or next hour. You just send, it's a web service, you send the information, you get the ISWC back. It's nanoseconds. Okay.
Just too late.
Well, nanoseconds, if you have the metadata embedded into a recording, into the recording studio software, you use the API and you get the IWC.
It's still a bit of a challenge. Obviously, not every writer is in the PRO ecosystem. There's a lot of people who are not society members. In fact, the vast majority of people who write and create music are not, and probably will never be, a member of a society. And there are obviously a lot of hobbyists who are trying to get their music up to Spotify and so on. Do they have the vested interest, because they're going to make 2 cents from their track, to waste the time to go fill out 45 to 90 minutes worth of paperwork to make their 14 cents? I don't know. And is it the right thing to do?
It's not paperwork, first. And secondly, if their name is not related to the title, they will not get royalties. So at some point, they need to put a name.
It is absolutely still paperwork. We can go down to any PRO in this town and get signed up today.
Well, at the moment, maybe. Well, in some PROs, but this allocation service is available to PROs. I know at least one PRO that is testing this service. Okay. And again, it takes time because, and again, it's not only PROs, but also we could see it with, even including publishers, they need to change their own processes. We have been struggling to find publishers, independent publishers, or even major publishers to test this process because they need to change their own processes. They are calling for these numbers, okay, they are really putting pressure on us, and then they realize, oh, it's not so easy to implement. So it will take time, okay? And I agree that we are lacking time, but... Yeah.
And those unaffiliated songwriters, they do have a right under the ISO standard to get an ISWC. So, and it's never been quite clear to me how well that really works. If you ring up ASCAP or BMI and say, I'm not one of your members, but I'd like one of your codes, please. I'm not quite sure how that works.
Well, and one of the things that Paul and I have talked about many times is, is it having a provisional ISWC that then when everyone is identified, then it can convert into being the final ISWC.
Well, that's functionally equivalent to what Sylvain's implementing. It's about this pudding eating process. How quick does it actually happen? When the recording's finished and you've got it, you're done, can you get it there and then? Because if it's 2 minutes later, when you've already sent the master file off, it's too late. And
on the sound recording side, once you send the master off, then the ISRC is assigned to that master by the label.
That's
correct? Right. And the label has a list of ISRCs that they can assign.
Not just the label, but an aggregator can assign an ISRC. But a layperson cannot assign an ISWC. A layperson cannot get an ISWC currently. So you have to be a member of a PRO currently to get an ISWC. You cannot just get one of any other way, correct?
Well, you can, at least one of the creators of the musical work has to be a member of a PRO. That's correct.
Well, that's not what the ISO standard says. It says that a non-member has a right to get one of those codes.
Yeah,
and I'm just never quite sure how that works.
We don't get many of these requests. And again, I mean, this is one step, and we are here. I mean, I'm coming here as well to speak to you, So, I mean, if there are people in the room or companies that are making those recording studios, software in studios, they are welcome. We can speak together and see, how we can improve the process still.
So I think we have 1 minute, and I see Day has his hand up. So maybe we have time for one question to wrap it up, and then we'll all be here. We can talk about ISWCs and ISRCs all you want.
So much better than eating lunch.
Oh yeah.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Lisa and Paul, you asked a lot of my questions, so thank you for that. But I do want to follow up with what Paul was asking about, and Joe as well. So I own a company called Tune Registry, and we primarily work with self-published songwriters, and a significant majority of them are not affiliated with PRO at the time that they're registering works with us, which is after they've already distributed it to Spotify. And then we tend to, in our system, we don't register the works with Harry Fox and Music Reports and Louder and so forth until there's an ISWC, but then we're held back because we don't receive ISWC. So to follow what Paul was saying, I have two questions. One is, you mentioned the allocation service. Is that allocation service API going to be available to registrants or administrators, or is it just available to PROs? And the second question is, are songwriters who are not affiliated with a PRO eligible to get a ISWC, which currently, like as Lisa stated, it's not the case?
Well, this allocation service is, so I will go back to the question from Paul before, or from you before. This service at the moment is only available to societies, PROs, they can implement those services for their own affiliates. So it's not available to non-society writers.
Okay, and to the question in regards to, so if there's 4 songwriters in there and 3 are with ASCAP or BMI and 1 is with no one, will ISWC be assigned?
It'll be issued, yes. Because all these other societies will have issued it for that work.
You won't have an IPI, though, for the songwriter.
Right, for the one songwriter that does not have IPI, the NS, the non-society songwriter, will a ISWC be issued for the work?
Yes.
One for the
Yeah.
One for the work.
One for the work. And as long as there is at least one writer who is affiliated to a CMO, a PRO, they will get an ISWC. If there is another songwriter which is not a PRO member, we assign IP numbers to non-society writers. We do it today.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to go back and check some cases. We have cases where ISWCs are not being assigned when there's at least one writer who does not have an IPI number.
This is one issue that we have identified that we're working on.
Yeah. Thank you.